Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Tonight I'm going to be summarizing some research focused on the Excellence in Teaching pilot in Chicago Public Schools. And this comes out of one unit of our Urban Education Institute, the Consortium on Chicago School Research. And the consortium is one of 4 units that we have at the Urban Education Institute. We also train urban teachers there in the Urban Teacher Education Program, and I see several of our graduates in the audience. We also run 4 campuses of a charter school, University of Chicago charter school around the area around the University of Chicago. And we have a nonprofit organization called UChicago Impact that takes our educational tools to the country. And so that just to situate you in the consortium's research within the Urban Education Institute. And what I'm going to be telling you about tonight is summarizing the findings from a 2-year research study on Chicago's attempt to implement a very robust teacher evaluation system using the framework for teaching. And this occurred between 2008 and 2010. What I've done for you tonight is really to distill, I think, the most important research messages that apply most directly to the work that you're going to be doing in your own districts as you design teacher evaluation systems and as you prepare as teachers to embark on what is going to be a very dramatically different system of teacher evaluation, as you know. I would boil down the research questions that guided our study into 2 categories. One is it fair? How do we actually assess whether or not this framework for teaching and all of the kind of supports and development and pieces of the teacher evaluation system around it are fair? So there's a set of research questions that focus on fairness, on reliability and validity in particular. So reliability, 2 people go into the same classroom, they have the framework for teaching or whatever tool that they're using, how likely is it that those 2 observers will come up with the same rating? Remember, this is the basic foundational tenet, one of them, that Charlotte pointed to as incredibly important for an evaluation system. The second set of research questions focuses on another important question. Can it scale? So if it's the case that this teacher evaluation system only works and is only fair in schools that are a certain way, whether it be they have a principal with a certain type of instructional leadership skills or a certain type of school culture, if it's the case that it only works in certain types of schools, then it's not a system that's going to work in all the different types of schools that you have within your complex districts. So to summarize the picture in Chicago when this pilot was implemented, this was a pilot that was implemented in 100 schools. When it got to the 2nd year, it started in 40 and scaled to 100. And it actually involved a very robust set of practices around the framework for teaching. So for each of the observations, there was a pre-observation conference, followed by an observation, followed by the post-observation conference. It's also important to note that there was a lot of training associated with this initiative for principals, about 50 hours for the first cohort of principals around the framework for teaching. So what I'm going to give you today is just the highline main findings. I'm going to highlight 5 of them. First of all, we did find that the classroom observation ratings were both reliable and valid. So we found that there was consistency across the way that principals and external observers that we sent into classrooms with principals rated consistently. They rated consistently across their teachers. They rated consistently across components, the components that Charlotte just showed you, and they rated consistently, for the most part, across the rating scale. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We also found that there was a relationship between observation ratings and student growth. So this is looking at the validity part of the study, the relationship between having high ratings. Do teachers with high ratings also have high student growth metrics? And we found that in general that was the case. We also found, if we shift to the scale question, that principals and teachers were highly engaged and enthusiastic about this new process, and particularly about using the framework for teaching and this pre-observation and post-observation conference process around it. We also found, however, that despite high levels of engagement, despite the positive perceptions that principals and teachers had, we identified areas that principals and teachers need to grow in order to make these systems work. So I'm going to briefly go through each of these 5 findings, starting with the validity study. So what you see up here is a graph that summarizes the relationship between one component of the framework for teaching and student growth measures. And essentially what we've done with this analysis, and when you walked in, there was a stack of our reports sitting on the table, and if you didn't get one, you should visit our website because you can download the PDF of this. What I've done is just taken one component and shown it here. The report actually goes through 10 components across domains 2 and 3 and looks at this relationship. The way to understand this graph is to understand that what we've done is grouped teachers here by their ratings on this particular component. So all of the teachers who received an unsatisfactory rating are grouped together. All that received a basic rating are grouped together, proficient and distinguished similarly. And what we're looking at is the relationship between those teachers' rating and their student growth measure. And if this is valid, so if there's a strong relationship, a strong correlation between the observation rating and the student growth measure, what you would expect to see on this graph is that all the teachers who received the unsatisfactory ratings have a lower student growth measure than all that received the basic rating, have a lower student growth measure than those who received the basic, and those that receive the proficient and those that receive the distinguished. And you see in looking at this graph that that is the relationship that we found. We see this relationship, statistically significant relationship, across all of the components, which suggests that there is validity here, that there's a relationship between being high on the observation rubric and high in terms of student growth. So now let's talk a little bit about the consistency question. There are a lot of ways that we can answer the question about consistency, and in my introduction I actually talked about 3 different ways alone, about thinking about if principals are rating consistently across their teachers, across the components, and across the different levels on the scale of the framework rubric. What I'm going to show you here, and this is just a snapshot from the report, is a way of thinking about that in terms of principal severity. What you see on that graph, this is a lovely caterpillar graph, is each one of those dots represents a principal in the Chicago pilot. And what we're looking for here is whether or not they are severe, meaning do they give significantly lower ratings than the external observers that we sent in with them to look at practice, or do they happen to give significantly more lenient ratings? So are they consistently giving higher ratings than the external observers? If you look in the middle of the graph and you see those 3 pink dots, those are the external observers, which is really important because if they weren't clustered in the middle, it would mean that we're not making good comparisons. So we actually have spent a lot of time making sure that those external observers were synced with one another and we're giving reliable ratings, and now we're comparing principals to them. So the good news takeaway from this graph is that the majority of principals fall between 1 standard deviation, either above or below the external observers, which we would say suggests that the majority of these principals, So this is not my computer, but if anyone has a power cord, now would be a good time to bring it up. Or we're going to be winging it. But essentially, this is good news, that the vast majority of principals fall between within 1 standard deviation, either above or below the external observers. We would consider these to be consistently rating principals. Now I'm going to give a little bit of commentary on the principals that fall into that top and bottom pink box. They're either extremely lenient or extremely severe. I'm going to come back to that, but for now, the takeaway is a positive one. We see some consistency in ratings in Chicago with the principals that use this rubric. I just want to point out one thing about this, which is sometimes, and this was the case in Chicago, there are some district leaders who assume that the observation, the framework for teaching, is too complicated for principals, that an average principal couldn't do this. This absolutely refutes that idea. This suggests that principals with the right training and support can do this effectively. And of course, most of us in this room already knew that, but it's an important thing to note. So now let's talk about a different way of thinking about reliability. This is the rating scale reliability. So what we've done here is we've chunked up the rating scale into pairs. So that bottom bar is unsatisfactory and basic clustered together, the middle bar is basic and proficient clustered together, and the top bar is proficient and distinguished clustered together. Now, what you're looking for here, and again, we're comparing the external observers to principal observers, is if that is close to 1, that log odds is close to 1, that essentially means that for that part of the rating scale, we see a high level of consistency between external observers and principals. Is that the bottom bar, you may have noticed, was less than 1. It was actually at 0.74. So for the unsatisfactory and basic part of the scale, there is actually a very high level of consistency. And this is because at the unsatisfactory level, raters have a very high level of agreement of what unsatisfactory is. Part of it is by virtue of the fact that the framework level of unsatisfactory practice is quite low. And this is good news for feeling like there is a high level of consistency. Unsatisfactory is unsatisfactory. Now, you may remember that the top bar for proficient and distinguished was much bigger than 1. It's actually about 6.18. What this suggests is that actually the principals use the distinguished category much more frequently than the external observers. And the principals were very open about this. They acknowledged that this was the case. They knew that they were using the distinguished category more frequently. And they did it partially because they were moving from Chicago, and this is probably similar to many of your districts, into a paradigm shift in terms of the system. So this teacher received a superior last year, and now I'm calling them basic, now I'm calling them proficient. I'm just going to give them the distinguished and coach them up rather than have the debate about the new rating. So while they work on that, I'll go into the next set of findings, and this has to do with the scale questions. Digging deeply into the conferences aspect of this, these conversations that principals and teachers have with one another are an incredibly important part of evaluation. When Charlotte was talking about her greatest fears being that we invest all of this time in these revitalized teacher evaluation systems, and in the end we don't see a relationship in terms of improved student performance, and I would argue that one of the most important aspects of translating these great observation ratings into changes in instructional practice happen in these conversations between principals and teachers. If we don't get that conversation right, we won't see instructional growth. The first year of our study, we went in and had conversations with principals and teachers about those conferences. How did they think that those conferences, thank you. That was teamwork. So how do they feel about these conferences? Principals and teachers were very positive in that first year. They said, we're having much more reflective conversations. Using the framework for teaching makes these conversations more objective. They're evidence-based. There was a high level of agreement on that. It also was the case that principals were highly engaged. So we, in the report, do this complex kind of clustering analysis using qualitative and quantitative methods to actually cluster the principals into high, medium, or low level of engagement in the evaluation system. And what we found is that principals, the majority of principals were highly engaged and enthusiastic about this, and that continued even as the pilot expanded from 40 to 100 schools, which is really important. But being researchers, we had to dig a little bit deeper. And so we thought to ourselves, okay, so it's the case people are very enthusiastic about the conversations, but what actually is happening in the conversations? So the second year of our study, we spent a lot of time actually observing that whole observation series, the pre-observation, the lesson, the post-observation conference, and then going on to having individual debriefing conversations with the principals and teachers. And what I'm showing you here is just two of the several measures of conversation quality that we include in our report. The first one is, what are the nature of the questions that principals are asking teachers in these conversations as a way of thinking about quality? In many ways, this mirrors the component on the framework for teaching that focuses on the kind of questions that teachers ask of students as a part of instruction. And just a side note on that, one thing that is really interesting about the framework for teaching is that questioning and discussion technique component is the most difficult component to get high ratings on. It's one of the hardest things that you do as teachers, is ask appropriate questions to guide and push student learning. So we discovered we developed a parallel rubric to think about the questions that principals ask teachers in their conversations about instruction in the pre and post conference. And what you see here is just a summary table of what we discovered, which is that the vast majority of questions that the principals asked were low-level questions, yes/no questions, one-answer questions, and that only a very, very small percentage of time was spent in questions that we believed would promote instructional improvement. This is something that principals were very honest about in Chicago. For many of them, this was a big shift in the way that they were thinking about doing teacher evaluation. They acknowledged that they had no training or background in how to conduct these kind of conversations, and so this is an important takeaway. The second proxy of quality that I'm pulling out of the report is about who's doing the talking. This is really important. We just spent a lot of time analyzing the percentage of time of who's talking in the conversation. And what we found is that 75% on average of the talking in these conversations in the pre and post conference was done by principals. And what you have to understand is that that's an average. Some principals actually had much more balance. Some were teacher-driven conversations, and some had no teacher voice at all. So there's a lot of variation in the way that principals carry out these conversations, and that they acknowledged that they need a lot of training and support on this. So just to wrap up on the research findings, I want to return to this caterpillar graph, and this time I want to focus on the teachers who fit, or excuse me, the principals who fit in the shaded part of the caterpillar graph. So they're either significantly severe or significantly lenient relative to the external observers. And in particular, let's talk about those that are in the significantly severe category. What does that mean? In terms of rating, points on the rating scale, those principals that sit in that significantly severe box, on average, were about 1.5 points higher, or excuse me, lower, so more severe than the external observers. So if you think about the Danielson scale as a 4-point scale, it could be the difference between getting a distinguished rating and a basic rating. So for these principals, while it's the case that we celebrate the fact that the majority of principals were consistent in their rating, we can't forget about the fact that we need to provide the proper training and supports for principals who are falling outside of that consistent mark. And this is another really important takeaway of our research. So just to summarize the research takeaways, first of all, I want to emphasize that reliability and validity are a function of tool use, not of the tool. So if it's the case that we took Charlotte's fantastic framework and we implemented it in all of your districts with no training, it's highly unlikely that you would have the kind of reliability and validity results that I just showed you. This is a very critical part. We can't shortchange the training or we won't get the kind of fair system that teachers deserve. And underneath that are these other bullets about fairness also. There has to be some kind of checks and accountability built into these systems. Part of that is in having multiple measures. So having multiple ways of thinking about teacher effectiveness that provide a check on one another. So if it's the case that you have teachers who have very high observation rubric ratings, but very low student growth, they're very low on student surveys, you need to start asking questions about why it is that your multiple sources of information are giving you a different picture. Part of that is giving teachers every opportunity to be high on all of these different kinds of measures as a protection for them. Part of it is also around providing the appropriate training and support and accountability for principals as well. And I emphasize again the importance of coaching principals to coach teachers. We can't leave principals out of this. They need training and they need support in order to be able to do this well. This focus on teacher development is really an important part of this, and this again lines up with a lot of the comments that Charlotte made. The primary goal of these systems has to be around teacher development, not around sanctioning teachers. So building systems with an eye towards that and not forgetting that is really important. The last slide that I'm going to show you just has some final considerations on it. This comes from the chapter 4 of our report, but as you're building your own systems, these are things that we identify as issues you should be attending to early in your districts. How do you calculate the final evaluation ratings? This is really an important question. What kind of weights are you going to assign to the different measures? What kind of measures are you bringing in? The observation logistics are a killer. These are things you have to start thinking about ahead of time. How many observations will you have? Are they formal? Are they informal? What kind of data systems do you have to support it? Training, incredibly important, as I said, both upfront training and ongoing for all of the important stakeholders and decision makers and principals and teachers in the system. And principal engagement and feedback for the evaluator equally as important. So I would encourage you, as you're digging in, if you're from districts who are working on this, to take a look at that chapter to give you some guidance. So just in closing, as Charlotte and I go into a question and answer session with you, I would just say that we had very sort of remarkable findings from Chicago, and that there is a lot to learn, I think, from the kind of time and energy that they put into designing a fair system. And the training was a key part of that, and so was the district's commitment to ongoing improvement in the system. Thank you.